Welcome to another Telltale Books video. I'm Greg,
I'm Emily.
and this video we are going to do a topic that we've been wanting to do on the question of what is the legitimate way to approach a book through your own interpretation or the author's intent. Who is more important to consider? So,
this is a real hard one, too.
The way a book happens is a person has an idea and they want to write it, they want to turn it into a book, they want to publish it. And so they have an intent that they want to have happen through the book. Nobody sits down to do anything like a book or a painting or a musical composition without a goal in mind that they want to achieve with it.
Yes.
Okay. So that work does not come into existence without the author having their intent. So then the author puts it out into the world, and we all know what happens from there.
Everyone decides they have an opinion.
The space station is a symbol of God and man's.
This is a social commentary on blah 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 blah.
Yeah.
And generally, one could argue, yes, that having a personal attachment or finding something allegorical that's meaningful to you in a work is valid. But, I'm going to say something really controversial now. Just because it's valid doesn't make it relevant to everyone universally.
Yeah.
Especially to the author who had intent. And so while I think there is a lot of merit to finding things that you enjoy in a book or relate to or can value or find validity with, and that you come up with your own allegories or you see allegories there that maybe no one else noticed, and that you have an opinion, it does not ultimately make it relevant. Because everyone has a different perspective. And when you try to bring your perspective into things, you can run into situations like the Bible, where people bring in all their arguments and all their opinions and all their things without understanding any of the context of what's going on, and can argue just about anything. Because when you look at a work, there's only, 26, I think? 26 basic storylines that you can have. And the longer the book is, the more likely that there's a multitude of those things in there.
Yeah.
So of course things are going to come across as allegorical. But your experiences and your biases are not everyone else's. And you can't sit there and assume all the time that you're right.
Yeah.
Now, there was, oh gosh, I wish I could remember what author it was. There was an author who wrote a book. And when they did a lecture on it, they got booed out of their own lecture because no one agreed with what he said he actually wrote the book about. And so the danger he ran into was that public opinion was greater than his intention. Despite everything he said. I want to say it was like Tolkien. When he wrote like Lord of the Rings or something, because everyone was saying, oh yeah, there's so many allegories about God because he was a Christian and blah blah blah. And even C.S. Lewis was like, how dare you write a book and be a Christian and not make it allegorical. You know, and because C.S. Lewis was very much like, oh, my faith is so much a part of my life that what I'm writing is intentionally allegorical. And he couldn't believe that Tolkien would not do the same thing. And Tolkien was very adamant about making sure, he said, no, I wanted to write a contemporary Anglo-Saxon myth of my time.
Yeah.
I wasn't intending to make anything Christ-like. I wasn't trying to make theological statements. I wasn't trying to make these races in my book allegories to races in the world. I was building a world of fantasy. For the sake of making an Anglo-Saxon myth.
Yeah.
And people will still argue to this day and write essays about how he was wrong. All the time.
Yeah.
And so we run into this danger where people can misconstrue the message so much that we lose track of the importance and the context of what the author's intention was.
Yeah. Though sometimes you create something and you have your intention of it and you put it out there and somebody comes along and says, oh, I see this in there. And you go, oh, yeah, I never thought of that. Sometimes it enhances it.
Yes.
Both for the artist and for the general public. They're getting something more out of it than the artist himself actually intended. Or their self actually never occurred to them.
Yes. Which doesn't have to innately be a bad thing.
Painting a still life. I didn't think it was going to be any kind of allegory, you know.
Yeah.
But it makes it cool that people see that and you go, oh yeah, it can be read that way.
Yes.
On the other hand, there's times when people condemn books for being racist, sexist, and the author, and they condemn the author then as being racist, sexist, misogynist, and the author, they're writing characters, they don't necessarily agree with their characters.
Yes. They're not writing themselves into their stories every time. They may
purposely, but people often make that assumption that the main character is just like the author.
Yes.
But the author isn't necessarily writing about himself. He may be writing about some guy you saw on the street, or maybe writing a book that's a thinly disguised satire on a political figure or something, and that's what the main character is. And so the author is not racist, not sexist, not misogynist, not not a bad person.
Yes.
But people still nail them to the wall because they have this book that
makes them feel something strongly that they had an opinion about, but that opinion wasn't relevant. But it's such a popular opinion that people can't believe that it's not relevant.
And in a time like the 1960s, how do you get society to change from what we felt was wrong without writing books that made it apparent that it was wrong, by writing books that exaggerated it and
took it to extreme.
And so then you had to write books where you were purposely being
a terrible
showing racism, showing misogyny and stuff like that for the purpose of making the point that this is not who we should be.
I mean, you could sit down and look at the life of, like, let's say Philip K. Dick, for instance. I don't know a lot about his personal life, but if you based who he was based off of Man in the High Tower, you're gonna think he was a Nazi. And that he thought Germany should win, instead of an American human being who decided to write an incredibly interesting alternate history for the sake of posing the question of, what if? What would that look like? How would it affect people? How would people rebel? How would people conform? And just taking this fantasy and building it based off of a historical incident that could have gone the other way. You do run into that danger. We also, though, experience the opposite, where we idealize an author because of their work and get severely let down as a public.
Yeah, when we find out they're just a schmuck like the rest of us.
J.K. Rowling is a great contemporary example of that, where we see her making political stances against certain people groups that come across as extremely hateful and extremely prejudiced to the rest of the public. But there's this beloved fantasy that she wrote that seems very idealized and has these high moral ground characters that just want to save the wizarding world and do good and make sure everybody lives happy and healthy lives, while she herself is making these decisions that a lot of people are very upset about.
Yeah.
And I think at the end of the day, J.K. Rowling was just writing a fiction. She wasn't writing herself.
Right.
So we are allowed to enjoy that idea, the messages that she told in that story, even if it's not who she is as a person. There's a lot you can take away from personal perspective.
And she may have changed as a person from when she wrote the first Harry Potter book.
Humans are not infallible.
Right.
And so as authors or as people, you know, again, you can't sit there and make informed opinions and just assume you're right based off of the way somebody writes. Like, there's a lot of authors, incredibly talented, great moral moral stories, very interesting, deep philosophical discussions, absolutely terrible people.
Yeah.
Really, all you're getting when you read a story is that an author has a complex mind, and a lot of ways to describe that into words.
Right.
If you have something to take away from it and that holds value to you, I don't think there's anything innately wrong with that. But assuming that that's what the author and the rest of the public should agree with is extremely self-righteous when you think about it.
Yeah.
Like, to think you're also... And, like, even an author will write a story and not think they're right about the morality or anything they wrote in the story. They're just composing something cool and interesting.
Yeah.
Or some of them might be just self-righteous, like, I don't know, Stephen King. He comes across as very self-righteous, but he's very successful. He has a lot of clout and a good leg to stand on, at least, maybe 2 legs to stand on, because he has been so successful.
Yeah.
So a lot of it's this interesting balance of what's most important. Is it what you can take away from the story, or what the author's intention was to tell you in the story? And I think it's a good balance. But it is also not infallible.
Yeah.
You can't get away with, like, there are ways to corrupt it. And there are ways to misinterpret it in a very bad way that can harm you as a person and harm society.
Yeah.
And I think whenever you approach anything you're reading, having the context and the intention of the author, or, like, I'm going to keep bringing up the Bible because this is very interesting to me. Having the societal and social context of the things that are happening in the Bible is extremely important to the work, and understanding how society works when you're looking at it from not just a mythos, I'm going to say, standpoint, but from a historical standpoint. Because some of the stuff in the Bible really did happen. And some, we can't decide whether, you know, what parts are fantasy and what aren't, because there are proven historical things. But you also have the Epic of Gilgamesh that does the same thing.
Yeah.
And even alludes to stories from the Bible that we know to help reinforce those myths, or to help reinforce those events, even. So understanding...
Bible's a good example because it's written by multiple people.
Yes, with multiple histories.
After they wrote their different books, they were all collected together, and a bunch of guys got together and decided which ones were true and which ones weren't.
Yes.
And you just got to think that maybe, you know, Price is sitting back there going, guys, wait a minute, guys, come on.
Yeah.
Seriously?
You left the Book of Judas out? Really?
Yeah.
That was important. Like, what? And then, of course, the Catholic Bible versus what is considered the, I guess... I don't know what to call it, like, the other Bible, like, the Catholic Bible and, I guess, Protestant Bible.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know a better way of describing it. You know.
Well, the King James Bible was a rewrite from the earlier languages.
Yes.
And there were things that changed.
Yes, and there were untranslatable words, or words that had multiple translations, and they had to just do their best educated guess. But having the holistic understanding, not just the author's intent to take account of events, but to understand historically what was going on in the culture and have a more holistic view of everything is extremely important. Like, I once did a Bible study on the Book of Ruth. The Book of Ruth is controversial in the Bible because it doesn't actually mention God. But when you start looking at the circumstances and the calendar dates and the significance of what happened on what date and certain certain circumstances and what the rules were for Persian kings making laws, all of that taken into account, you understand why it was chosen to go in the Bible despite not mentioning God. It actually is too coincidental with too many things for it to have been just happenstance. And that's why they chose to put it in the Bible. When they did the, Council of Nicaea or whatever they called it? The Council of Nicaea. It's because even though God wasn't mentioned by name, there's just so much in the whole context as a whole with biblically significant dates and biblically significant circumstances that happened at the same time that they realized this is too important to leave out of the story. And this was pivotal for the Jewish people to have morale in order to survive the circumstances. Because basically, the king said, wipe out all the Jews. And circumstances changed in a manner that the Jews were able to not be wiped out. And so it's just one of those things where if you didn't have that context, you wouldn't understand why they had chosen and set a standard for putting it in the Bible, despite it not mentioning God. Yeah. And I think there's a lot of theology and things, too, that we make decisions based off of not just personal feelings or like taking it literally, but understanding the context is very important to be able to make religious and moral decisions if that's your religion and you're basing your entire life on that religion. And I think taking things allegorically or taking your own opinion with you and saying, oh, like, this is what this means because that's how I interpret it, is dangerous in a religion, because now we have how many different denominations? Yeah. Because of differences in opinion. We no longer have the unified church that everybody had hoped for. No. And so, yeah, that's a very extreme version of author's intent versus what a person can take away from a story. So again, it's kind of one of those things where you can have an opinion all you'd like, but that doesn't make it relevant because the author did have an intention. So then it brings up, though, the commentary of how much do we follow public opinion? And that's a decision every individual has to make on their own terms. Yeah, though most people, they see something on YouTube and they instantly believe it. Yes. They want to have conformity and seek acceptance in believing it. If it's coming from somebody that they watch all the time and trust. Yes. Then that person, whatever they say, they just follow that. Yeah. Or whatever their pastor says, they just follow that. Or whatever their professor says and tells them to think about a story, they just follow that. Without really following all the context. Yeah, I feel we see that a lot in BookTube, where somebody will, a certain somebody who has a popular channel will read a book and talk about it and say how great it was. And then within a month, you have 30 other videos where they went and read that book and they all agree. And they're all like completely in line with that. Yeah. Saying the exact same thing about this one book. Yeah. And it's like, wait a minute, don't any of you have any of your own personal ideas? Yeah. Are you just going to regurgitate the first idea of somebody you like? You're just gonna or because it's trending? Because you like that person? Or yes. Because that person gets lots of views? It just doesn't sit right with me. Yeah, it doesn't sit right with me either. And we also have to take into account, because authors aren't infallible. Like, I once was looking through feminist quotes on the internet, just, kind of taken out of context and whatever. And I read this really great quote about women in education, and basically the gist of it, I don't remember it verbatim, but the gist of it was, the strength in a nation is how educated their women are, because women do most of the caretaking and the home building. They are literally the ultimate backbone of a nation. And expanding their capabilities can only help that nation. Saddam Hussein said that. No. And so, like, people can say good things and still be horrible people. And commit atrocities. Hitler said some very interesting things that aren't innately wrong. That's one that I don't think I can really chime in and say that you're right, saying he was a horrible person. Yeah. Because there's just too many questions about what happened in Iraq. Yeah. There's just too many questions, too many things. Why did we go in there on the basis of false intelligence reports?
maybe he wasn't a bad guy.
Maybe.
And he was just made to appear that way by
Yes.
people who wanted him out of the way.
And I can get that. That's a valid question. But again, we can also bring up Hitler, because why not?
Yeah.
Hitler said some things that were not innately bad or wrong. Yes, true. Because he was appealing to human emotion, though. Were they lies in most cases? Yes. They were not things he had planned on following through with. And unfortunately, he did commit atrocities, having said them. And it was bad and wrong of him. And he was a pretty evil person.
Yeah.
There's no question about that one. That was pretty evil to commit that genocide.
But even that one is a little hard to be totally harsh on, and I know we're gonna get canceled.
No, it's valuable to talk about that. Like, he wrote Mein Kampf, and there are things in there that
you
aren't.
gotta understand where Germany was at after World War One. The context is important. Totally demoralized.
Yes,
and they fell into a lot of just bad morals. Prostitution and crime and things were just really bad in Germany. Mm-hmm. Hitler rose to power because he wanted to change that and get Germany cleaned up, basically.
Yes, but he chose to blame people groups for the reason that it wasn't cleaned up, and then
unfortunately, he had some
he murdered a lot of people.
Bad opinions, and he went too far.
Yes,
if he would have stopped at just making Germany more powerful, cleaning up his own country, bringing Germany back on a path with their traditions, and not gone and started beating up Jews and
special needs people
sending planes into Poland. Mm-hmm. He would be seen completely different today.
Mm-hmm. Basically, if he hadn't been caught, if he hadn't been caught for all that stuff, he would have come off. And that's fair. And Mein Kampf kind of reiterates that. Mein Kampf was not necessarily... It wasn't the greatest work ever, but it is very important to read because you can see how the brainwashing happened. Yeah. You can see how he said innately good things to empower people and make them feel good. Mm-hmm. And that was absolutely his intention, was to get people on his side so that he could gain power. Yeah. So even author intent is not good. Like, we gotta admit that.
Sometimes, yeah.
Yeah, sometimes. And really, again, public opinion is a huge part of coming into play with this. Mm-hmm. Public opinion is that murder is wrong and genocide is wrong. Mm-hmm. So Hitler is evil because genocide is wrong. Yeah. And we're running into that now with Gaza, where now Israel's looking pretty evil because genocide is wrong based off public opinion. Yeah. And Saddam Hussein is the same. Conflicts in India, conflicts, in Rwanda. All of that was considered wrong because of public opinion. Mm-hmm. So is it innately bad for that to be public opinion? That brings up the other question.
Well, is it innately bad for... Is the public right?
Yes. What constitutes as right? Mm-hmm. And that is the biggest question. And
we generally...
Bringing it into literature.
we generally make the assumption that the majority opinion is the best opinion and that's what should be followed. Mm-hmm. But that's not necessarily always true. I mean, there are certain things that just aren't open to opinion. They're just... This is the way it is. Yeah. And I don't care if 90% of the people say it's false. Mm-hmm. It's not false. It's true.
Yes. We do run into that, like social contract. The concept of the social contract is very much what a lot of our morality is actually rooted in. Some will say religion, and I do think that does play a play too, but the social contract is actually an older thought. Where it's just don't hurt other people surrounding you and try to help them, and they will be more willing to reciprocate. Yeah. And you're more likely to live in peace and community and in harmony if that's the case. Mm-hmm. And so public opinion has value in that what's rooted in trying to help community and help survival and help each other is a better route to take. How does genocide play into that? It doesn't, because it eliminates people who have the potentiality to be a part of that community and to be useful within it. Mm-hmm. And it also leaves you open for the potential of retaliation. Yeah. And we can think about that too in the concept of authors and their intent.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if what you're saying is inhibiting, or is, I guess, could potentially cause harm or encourage others to do harm,
Mm-hmm.
is it safe for you to do? You know, is it good? Is it safe? Is it abiding by the social contract, or is it encouraging people to harm more, innately, or is it calling people innately to harm more? And when we look at like Mein Kampf, that's basically what Hitler was arguing for.
Mm-hmm. But for things like morality and ethics, there isn't a set in stone tablet. This is law. It changes.
Yes,
over
as
time.
as public opinion changes.
I've seen that in my own lifetime, that what was viewed as okay and acceptable when I was a kid is no longer okay and acceptable. It's now totally wrong, and people will get in your face about it.
Yeah, in light of new information. Yes,
it's things that change, and so when in Rome, do as the Romans do.
Yeah,
you have to take an attitude like that. The things that we hold important and inviolable today are not going to be so 50 years from now.
Yes,
something they
there
may
is an
still
ebb and
be
flow.
kind of there, but they're going to mutate and change over time, and things will be different. And if we could transport ourselves from now to that time 50 years from now, we wouldn't recognize our society. It's going to be something that it's like, where'd this come from?
Yes. Yes. Things like Riders of the Purple Wage will feel potentially feel very relevant in the future. Which is a very interesting work. Go check out our video about it.
Yes.
It's too much to describe here and now, because this is already going to be a long conversation. But yes, the ebb and flow, which is why I think to some degree there has to be that balance of, yes, an author has intention, but what you take away from it is still meaningful and valid. But ultimately, there is no right answer of which is more important.
Yeah.
Because society has such a vast ebb and flow of how it perceives things and how the individual perceives things. And the values of certain societies and certain generations are going to be vastly different.
Another good example, which is relevant right now because of the release of the movie, is William Burroughs' Queer.
Ooh,
William Burroughs was queer. And he wrote a book titled Queer. But a lot of people have criticized the book because of some politically incorrect, by today's standards, things that he put into that book.
But at the time,
but in his day,
perfectly legitimate to use.
Yeah, everybody used it, including the people like William Burroughs that referred
to. Other people who were LGBTQ+.
And they didn't see a problem there. So that's what I mean by how things shift. And now that book is politically incorrect, but it's William Burroughs. He was queer. He was talking about himself.
Yeah. His experiences, maybe through a fiction, but still, his intention was to speak from his own experience.
Yeah.
And yes, to have other people within that same community reject him would be very difficult and would be kind of like,
and I find that
a little jarring.
I find that disturbing because he was like the first person to come out and really put it out there, and be explicit about what his life was like. And back then it was hard, way harder than anybody has it today.
Yes, now there's at least a community of support, whereas back then everybody had to be in the closet basically for survival purposes. And
you couldn't own up to it, but
and especially for males. I feel like it was harder for males than females because there was a lot more it was more socially acceptable for single, quote-unquote single women to live together and conduct their lives as lesbians. Yes, granted in the closet, but it was far more questionable for men to live together in community. And so it was much more highly suspect to hide the fact that you were gay and still conduct a homosexual life. Like, I think, that is a very, very interesting perspective and a really good point.
Yeah, and I it just blows my mind that people would condemn somebody who was a pioneer at opening things up.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's like the new wave science fiction writers of the 60s. A lot of them, their books come across kind of what people today would call misogynist, but they were trying to break through the more conservative attitudes from the 50s. They were trying to break through that and destroy it.
Yes.
And they had to have a certain amount of courage and put certain things out there that would shock people in order to
and might come back to haunt
change.
them or bite them in the butt and hurt them. You
know, now people are reading those novels thinking, well, this isn't so good because it's misogynist. He treats women like crap and stuff like that. And well, no, he was trying to
make the point that that's what's happening.
To outrage people.
Yes.
He was doing that on purpose.
That was the point, was to make people realize that this is crazy. Yeah. And that's another thing too. You start getting into more issues with that, with like that gray area of satire and trying to understand that the intention was satire. Because there's so many people who read satires and like, this is great, this should be a textbook on how to blah blah blah, and it's like, you absolute fucking idiot. Like, no, the intention was it to be satire, but people don't get that. Like, I've had a lot of people who have read Animal Farm, and they're like, this is so interesting. Yeah. It's like, this is really good idea. What? Are you stupid? The point was it to make it outrageous so that you didn't think it was a good idea and saw everybody get hurt. Like, what? So, yeah. It's a hard power pull. Like, both sides have a lot of weight. But unfortunately, I think there is this very dangerous, stronger pull to societal opinion. Yeah. And, like, the whole point is that everyone is flawed and nobody's perfect. So even authors with their intentions are not going to have good intentions every time. Or their intentions will be good, but the society might make, you know, something worse of it. Because, I mean, nobody's perfect. And so what it comes down to is, how do you hold space for both in society? Yeah. And as a reader. And I think this is a good time, too. There's a really great book called How to Read a Book for All It's Worth. And it kind of goes through and talks about the importance of understanding context and making sure you take time to read what the author's intention was. And especially, like, when you're dealing with historical fictions and stuff, actually read about those historical events that took place. One, to make sure they're accurately portrayed, and two, because they're important to know, because not every school teaches about every historical event. Yeah. And so making sure that you're as well informed as you can be when you go into reading something is just intelligent reading. Now, there are things that, you know, you don't have to do that with. Court of Thorns and Roses, it's just a fun fantasy. And you're allowed to let those things be fun fantasies and meet them where they're at. And take away from them what you will. But when it comes to things that have intention to be more than just entertainment and a good fantasy story, it's important to hold that in high value. Yeah. And it's important to make sure that you're an informed reader. And that's what good readership is all about. Anything further to say?
Just that for us as reviewers, it's that much harder.
Yes.
Because in trying to talk about these things, you know, we don't, you know, we're reader reviewers. We're not English professors. Yeah. We don't have time to research every aspect of the author's life and all the critical literature about the work. We read the book. And I usually do go on the internet and look up some historical facts regarding the author, regarding the book, try to find one or two reviews or something. But that's all the farther I have time to go to gather the evidence of what the author's intent was.
Yes, and I will often Google things too. What has been fortunate is that a lot of the classics we have read, and because I'm a lot closer to college graduation than you are, is a lot of this I remember from college. There's a lot of the stuff that we've touched on when I was in college, including stuff I talk about with the Bible, because I went to a Christian school. Yeah. which is very interesting.
I went to art school.
Yeah. Well, and it's very interesting, and I think that's an important thing to remember, too, because that's a very, very important book to a lot of people in the world, but making sure you read it with good understanding and with, you know, good intentions and just trying to understand it as holistically and intelligently as you can is important. Yeah. But I feel like a lot of literature needs to be approached that way.
But end of the day, we're not writing a PhD.
Yeah. This is just knowledge, basic knowledge that we have.
We're just readers. We're reading it to enjoy it, and we're reporting about it on our YouTube channel. So there's only so much we know about the author's intent. And of course, even for living authors, we don't have the opportunity to actually talk to the author.
Yeah.
And a lot of the authors we read are dead anyway. Yeah. So we get out our Ouija
have
board.
We have to conduct a seance and try and see if we can commune with them. And even then, a ghost might pose as them just to be funny, so we might not get the real story. Yeah. You never know.
So we're mostly relying on our own selves to figure it out and report on
basic information,
what we're seeing in these stories.
Yes,
and I think that's for the vast majority of people, that's what they're doing when they pick up a book, is they're reading it from their perspective, and they're not going to be learning all the details of the author's life or anything.
And it's not necessary for everything. Yeah, it's not necessary for everything.
Yeah.
But I think that's what being a reviewer is about. We are not here to forcibly feed you the intentions of the author.
Right.
Our job is to tell you what kind of reader would enjoy the book we just read.
Mm-hmm.
And to let you know if we are that type of reader or not.
Yeah.
Because, yes, the average person is just going to approach a book and read it to enjoy it.
Mm-hmm.
Or to be informed by it. Sometimes they're reading we read nonfictions to be informed by it.
And you don't.
Yeah. What?
You read nonfiction for pleasure.
I mean, I like learning. So yes, accumulating knowledge is a pleasure to me. So I do enjoy reading for that reason. But in that case, a lot of the information is already handed to you.
Yeah.
The author's intention is right there. And they're very blatant about it and describing it to you.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, some things are just meant for joy.
Yeah.
And that's okay. And if that's how you approach reading for entertainment, that's okay too.
Yeah, because you're just going to have to take out of that story whatever you get out of it. Mm-hmm. Whatever interpretation you're pulling from it, that's what you have to go by. Yeah. Because that's all you got.
So there is no way to say if the author's intent.
Yeah, there's no
or
absolute way to ensure that you are following the author's real intent.
Absolutely.
Unless you live with that author.
Yep. And as long as you don't hurt anybody.
Yeah.
Like what you like, don't harm anyone.
Mm-hmm.
Do no harm. Right. Take no shit.
Okay, so I think we should wrap this up.
Yeah, we pretty much hit the conclusion. We spoke a lot about a lot of controversial things today. So, comments, concerns.
Be nice.
Yes, please be respectful to each other and to us. We are only human, and we are only here to make points and sometimes have some shock value with what we say and pose questions. And I think that is important and valid to do. So, please be respectful, like and subscribe. We'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.